Okay, yeah. So yeah, thanks everyone for joining today's AI seminar. We're happy to have Professor Dan Goldwasser from Purdue University, where he's an associate professor at the Department of Computer Science. So I think Professor Dan Goldwasser has done lots of very impactful work on connecting natural language with real-world scenarios and using them to guide different natural language understanding tasks. His current interests focus on grounding in political discourse to support understanding real-world scenarios using neuro-symbolic representations. And I think I do have seen lots of recent works Dan's group has done on understanding news articles, for example. We also have ongoing research which follows those work. Yeah, and also Dan completed his PhD in computer science at University of Illinois at Urbana-Champaign, I think with Professor Dan Ross, and was a postdoctoral researcher at the University of Maryland. And he has received research support from the National Science Foundation, including a recent career award, and also support from DARPA and Google. Yeah, so let's welcome Dan to talk about joint models for social, behavioral, and textual information.
Thank you. Can you see my screen, or should I share again?
I think we are seeing you.
Oh, okay, so
yeah.
How about
okay,
now?
Yeah, now the screen.
Awesome. All right, hi everyone, and thanks for having me, and thanks for the kind introduction. My goal in this talk is to introduce some recent work and some not so recent work that we've done in my group over the last 5 years or so. The main idea is we're trying to connect language analysis, and more specifically in this talk, I'm going to focus on political discourse analysis and opinion analysis. And we argue that in order to do that, you need to rely on other kinds of information. And in a way, understanding opinions has to do, or is impossible without, connecting it to some real world environment. In general, before I get started, if there are any questions, please feel free to stop me at any time. After I've finished making these slides, I noticed that I'm being very, very optimistic about how much I'll be able to accomplish in this talk. So, I might need to sort of move on in case I run out of time. All right, so if you need to summarize this talk in a single slide, you can think about it in the following way. So looking at something that has unfortunately become very frequent on social media after a mass shooting event, the expression thoughts and prayers, typically used to express some sense of solidarity with the victims and their families. If we were try to get some actionable information out of this, for example, does the author believe that we should limit gun access? For example, if the author is a politician, a member of Congress, and some bill on the topic was placed in front of them, how would they vote? And then we noticed that actually thoughts and prayers could be interpreted in different ways. So there is the original way in which it's discussed, so thoughts and prayers as an expression of solidarity, but more recently, it is used as a way to attack the sort of lack of action, lack of legislative action by Congress by saying thoughts and prayers are not enough. So depending on who is saying that and what are their beliefs about what the direction of the country should be, this expression takes different meaning. So in short, context is really everything. And without it, it's going to be really, really hard to understand language. The focus of this talk is on analyzing political discourse, specifically looking at social media as a way to provide us with this context. As I'm sure all of you have noticed by now, social media has sort of become the prominent space for public and political discourse. And recent studies show that social media and this kind of discourse on social media is a contributing factor for polarization. If you analyze activity on social media, the picture becomes quite clear. Most people that talk about politics in social media are on the extreme side of things, both on the left and on the right. put in conjunction with the fact that this is also the place where most people in the US get their access to news information, it is clear that we need to have some way to understand public discourse on social media, analyze it, and potentially find ways to mitigate its negative effect, such as polarization and the creation of echo chambers. So there is a great opportunity for NLP for analyzing this text. So analyzing these kinds of opinions can help us provide context for understanding them and provide alternative perspectives if those are missing. It can help us understand political messaging at scale and to try to quantify the effectiveness of this messaging. For example, if there is a campaign to encourage people to get a COVID vaccine, we can try to understand whether framing the need for a vaccine as something that helps protect you or protect society, which one of those is more effective. It can help combat information echo chambers and introduce other perspectives, and so on. The underlying issue when trying to provide all of these beneficial effects is finding ways to contextualize information and connect it with the topic at hand. When talking about context, there is this tendency to somehow think about it as something that is contained within the linguistic side of things. So language provides context for understanding other language. This view has been popularized in the last couple of years by models that have been tremendously successful, such as BERT and GPT-3. For example, this is an example taken from my NLP course. The word sick could mean not good, someone who's feeling not great, or awesome, if we're talking about a product or something that's exciting. Based on linguistic context, we can figure out that a person can feel bad, but a phone is probably awesome. So just depending on the context in which the word sick appears, what is its target, we can disambiguate its meaning, despite the fact it's essentially a contradictory meaning. However, when we look at other things, for example, this movie is sick, well, right here, sorry. If we try to understand what is the meaning of sick in the context of movie, well, for the same movie, some people would say, this movie is sick. It has so many disturbing issues and that I don't want to see. And I think the person who made it is sick in their mind. Another alternative interpretation would be this movie has all of these disturbing things. It is wonderful and I enjoyed seeing it. So depending on the speaker, the meaning of sick was going to be completely different. And in general, we are targeting such environments where we really do need this social context, either to complement the linguistic input or to provide more context, provide a source of supervision, and so on. In social media, we typically assume that there is a shared context that everybody understands. And as a result, the text alone is very, very short and concise. And if you don't have access to this context, then really you have no way of understanding what the conversation is about. So when we're talking about contextualized text understanding, we're trying to construct a coherent interpretation for the text that's consistent with different points of view expressed in the context of the real world event that a text pertains to, the identity of the author or the source of the text, the relationship that that author has with other people, and so on. So this results in a complex information map rather than just a single text in isolation. And this graph can capture both multiple documents, the entities and topics mentioned in them, perspectives that are expressed in the context of the topic, users, shares, likes, and so on. And we have to somehow find a way to process all of this information such that we get a coherent view. One of the directions that we've been really excited about in the last couple of years is to find ways to combine neural and symbolic approaches for doing this kind of contextualized discourse understanding. As their name suggests, neuro-symbolic approaches combine both symbolic and neural methods. Symbolic methods that have been sort of like less popular since the rise of neural networks view symbols or view entities and ideas as atomic things, and we can reason about them by figuring out their relationship, typically as a probabilistic or rule-based inference process. Neural methods rely on distributed representation of those symbols, and relations are represented over an embedding space. This is somewhat a limited view of the world because we can mostly say something about their similarity, and anything beyond that, a more nuanced relationship, is quite hard to represent. Neuro-symbolic methods are a great direction for NLP. We gave a tutorial about neuro-symbolic methods for NLP this IJCAI, and shameless plug, the slides, and I think also the video is online. So if you're interested, please feel free. So in our not sure what's going on with my slides. Okay, so opinion analysis and discourse analysis are a great fit for neuro-symbolic methods. On the one hand, for the neuro side, we have lots and lots of text and context and social interaction of social media at a huge scale, which allow us to create complex distributed representations of those elements. But on the other hand, when we're thinking about the kind of symbols that explain the text and the interaction on social media, we have very interesting and complex symbols. And in many cases, we have to rely on formulations that come from social science and psychology to create those symbols. For example, using framing theory, moral foundation analysis, and more. So on the symbolic side, we have a very interesting language understanding problem, which can be alleviated if we use the neural approach. Okay, so here are a couple of examples why this can be kind of cool for this domain. If you talk about healthcare as a human right, then you probably voted in favor of Obamacare. So if I'm able to identify that there is a symbol here, which is framing a certain topic in a certain way, for example, framing the topic of healthcare as a human right, then I can build some expectations about some real world behavior. So I can write this down in a declarative way that consists of entities and symbol, the tweets, the author, the framing dimension, and so on. In our neuro-symbolic view of the world, all of these elements are also embedded. So we also have an embedding for the topic healthcare, an embedding for the frame fairness, and also an embedding, a relational embedding for a tweet having the frame fairness. I'll talk about it in a little bit more detail in the following slides. These explanations can also pertain to the social context in which the tweet appears. For example, if the author is a Trump supporter, then the article that they author is more likely to oppose impeachment. And if the author follows the One America network, then the author is more likely to support Trump. So the part on the right provides me with some information about that I can derive from their social interactions on social media. And based on that, I can get supervision for a stance prediction problem over the text. Right? And we can show that this can actually be leveraged quite effectively. In the rest of this talk, I'll describe ongoing work that we do. I'll start by introducing a neuro-symbolic model that we developed for text and its social context. This framework is called Derail, and we released it last year. And one of the things that I'm really hoping would come out of this talk is that people will be interested and use it. It's open source. I'll then talk about the several symbolic explanations that we have developed for political perspectives, such as framing and moral foundations and their extensions. And finally, I want to talk about different ways in which we can change the way we do language representation to take into account the context in which it appears. And I'll introduce two frameworks for doing that. Before I get started, if there are any questions, that would be a great time. All right. So we define context in the scope of this talk as parsing the landscape of opinions and perspectives. So we're not just dealing with one text in isolation, but rather we are able to say something about some predictions such as the stance they express, the interactions between them. So what are the relationships? Do they support the same stance? Do they make the same argument? And so on. And we can come up with explanations for their perspective expressed in them. For example, by saying this claim, laws banning guns for citizens will create a safer environment, frames the topic of gun control as an issue of safety. I can also have another explanation by looking at the ideology underlying certain arguments. I can identify texts that share the same perspective, and so on. So we view this as a neuro-symbolic representation because we have symbolic explanations. For example, safety, the frame of safety is a symbol I can associate with some of those claims. And all of these things are represented in a distributed space, allowing me to determine the similarity between them and make predictions. So to kind of, you explain it in a less hand-wavy way, we can think about capturing the symbolic dependencies between these elements. For example, if I have two texts with different stances, I can think about a symbolic explanation for, in this case, like the frame dimension used to explain them. And then I can say, well, I'm going to probabilistically express an expectation that if two texts are contrasting, they disagree, they're going to frame the issue in a different way. And in general, framing gun control as an issue of safety is more likely to appear when people support gun control. And when we're talking about freedom of choice in the context of gun control, it's more likely to indicate an anti-gun control perspective. So we can think about this as inference in a probabilistic graphical model, where we have the output variables that we care about. For example, what is the stance, which we evaluate on. And when we have a collection of latent variables, which are the explanations, these are interdependent. Some of these could be, for example, the frame, the ideology expressed in the text, and so on. And these have to be internally consistent. For example, people who, on the issue of gun control, people who are on the left side of the map would talk more about safety, and they're going to express the opinion that they are in favor of gun control. We could easily come up with such an explanation for the right side of the map as well. We're going to quantify these kind of dependencies by thinking about them as factors in a graphical model, and we can learn that from data. This is a very general framework, and we've used it for several setups. Our original experiments relied on probabilistic soft logic framework that was developed by Elise Getour and her many students and collaborators. So when taking this perspective, we can think about it in a declarative way that is easy for humans to write and understand and debug. So we can, instead of writing it down as a factor graph, we can just express these dependencies as logical rules, where each one of these logical rules is then converted or compiled into a graphical model. And so here's the inference problem that we solve. We then do map inference to find the most likely interpretation across all of these probabilistic rules. In our setup, we're going to replace we're going to extend this factor graph to also take into account neural factors. When we're talking about the neural side of the neuro-symbolic, we would like to push information across different modalities. For example, we have the social modality, how people interact, how they support one another. And based on the principle of homophily, we can assume that people that are strongly tied socially are going to agree on a lot of their views. So if I'm able to characterize the social environment of an author, that is going to be consistent across their views on a certain topic are going to be consistent. And as a result, they can act as a form of supervision. So if I know something about the relationship between this text and this author, then I can implicitly say that this text should be close in embedding space to all of these other to the social group of that author. If I know something about contrasting social groups, people that fight on social media, well, maybe the opinions that they're going to express or the opinions that they're going to promote on social media also reflect this kind of disagreement. Characterizing that in a neural way is very, very straightforward and can be used later on for a probabilistic inference on the symbolic side. For example, by determining the contrast relationship. Okay, so from a technical perspective, when we were trying to capture these kinds of things, we're doing a form of graph embedding, and we've used several frameworks. From a very, very high level perspective, in the same way that contextualized word embeddings and transformers architectures try to create a representation of words as a function of the neighborhood that they appear in. In the context of graphs, embedding of nodes are going to be dependent on their graph neighborhood applied recursively several times. So every node is not just is not going to represent information about them, like the text that they've authored, but also people that they are strongly connected to on the social network and applied recursively. Derail that we've developed is a declarative framework for combining the two ideas. We can think about the rules as providing us context by writing down some expectations about what kind of symbols are likely to be consistent with each other and the vice versa. Or we can view context as the representation that we learn using neural architectures. And Derail allows us to combine it. So it's a declarative language. We are going to define these rules. Each rule is a neural network. And it is defined over a set of relations. Each one of those is embedded. And information about the embedding of the different relations is shared across all the rules in which the relation appears. We can then say something about the relationship between these two rules. For example, if I have a debate network, I have the basic rule of that looks at how people, what kind of ideas would people agree with. For example, I have a user U that makes a statement about a topic T, and I want to know whether they agree with how this topic is framed or not. I can look at other people that voted for that person, for this debating user on a social network, and then say, well, if they voted for that person and they agree with the topic, then clearly that person that they voted for must agree as well, right? And what we end up with is a graphical model that's defined over a relational embedding space where the different types of relations all share information. And as a result, we're doing a form of relational multitask learning. All right. So I'm going to, for the interest of time, I'm going to skip the technical part. We have applied this for debate networks where we have people who argue on topics. So we have a statement, an assertion about a topic, limiting gun sales is unconstitutional. And then we have text that's provided by the debating users. We're going to frame agreement as a form of a textual entailment problem, like whether the two are whether the long text implies the statement of opinion. And we also have information coming from social users, so which users voted for one another, which allows us to both model a representation of the text, so text-to-text inference, and user-to-user inference based on how they would vote. Interestingly, this is information that we can really use, and it's very helpful. So this is a learning curve where on the x-axis, we show how much information, how much training data we actually had. In the beginning, we had zero data. So all purely supervised model cannot do anything. So their performance is, basically random. In the, I guess, sort of dark gray and dark orange lines, we've used social information, not just text, where we learn a representation of user agreement and text agreement between users. and without any direct supervision, though, for opinion analysis for this textual entailment task. And just based on these social relationships, we're able to move from completely random to about 56% accuracy. When we use Derail to do this relational multitask learning, forcing consistency in the representation across social relationship, authorship relationship together, then this performance improves all the way to 62 or to 61. For those of you who are not impressed by 61 compared to 50% accuracy, the data is balanced, so 50 is random. I would like to remind that this is without any direct supervision at all. So this is just the direct benefit that we would get by modeling other kinds of alternative signals in the data that are correlated with this task. As we add more and more data, performance improves and until it starts to plateau. Okay, so in summary, Derail is a general framework for combining symbolic and neural representation. We can model dependencies either over the neural space or over the symbolic space using probabilistic inference. In the next step of this talk, I would like to talk about symbolic explanations for political perspectives, which is, well, even if you are able to make inferences in a symbolic space about what kind of arguments can be made to help identify a certain stance, the space of argument is unbounded, constantly changing, and constantly has to constantly adapt to new information. So finding the right abstractions, right symbolic abstractions for understanding opinions is really important. And it has to be done in some way that is not directly tied to, a news, something that a topic that currently hits the news cycle, which is likely to change, next week. So we want to find a way to decode political messaging and opinions. We're going to rely mostly on social media. This is a conversation, meaning that we can get a lot of information about who follows whom, which users choose to propagate and share information, and we can exploit it. On the other side, on the flip side, information on text on social media is highly ungrammatical, short. It uses coded language based on the social norms of the people inside specific groups, and it is constantly changing. So let's do a quick exercise. So here we would like to determine the stance of the political issue. This is a tweet by a strongly Republican member of Congress. 6 years later, healthcare costs have skyrocketed and millions have lost access to their doctors. #repeal Obamacare. So stance is very straightforward here. Well, clearly not a fan of Obamacare, that is easy. But if you would like to find the reason why or the argument that they're making, we can rely on using framing theory as an abstraction of that argument that supports the stance. For example, Obamacare should be repealed since it is too expensive is the explicit argument that this person is making. Capturing the fact that it was framed using the economic issue is an abstraction of the argument that's being made, and an abstraction that can be reused across several different topics to capture the correlation between frame usage and the type of stance that people would have. Here's a more difficult case. These are two tweets that are, again, unfortunately, in the wake of a mass shooting event. Both of these express, how sorry the author is and solidarity with their family. However, one of the authors is strongly supportive of gun reform, and the other one is strongly against it. Can anyone guess who is who, based on the text? So this is a very difficult task. There's no direct expression of the stance. Instead, if we read it carefully, we see that they're not completely identical. They're not equivalent. Both of them express their shock and sorrow about the event, but the first one frames the topic as something that has to do with solidarity. We stand united. There's a lot of us, our, we kind of language. On the other hand, the other tweet emphasizes the horrors, the sort of visceral effect of the mass shooting. It is horrifying, horror, and so on. So we would like to find a way. We would like to find a way to capture that. Analyzing the moral stance behind that provides us with a means to do it. And we're going to rely on moral foundation theory, which is a theory of morality developed by Jonathan Haidt and colleagues, and describes or captures moral sentiment across 5, now 6 different foundations. These foundations have, according to the theory, have emerged for social, evolutional reasons. You can think about it as, found elements that would allow society to function in a better way in the face of competition, allow it to collaborate against other competing societies, to better hunt in the really old days. And we have sort of internalized these principles, and the text that politicians write can be mapped back to these. So the first one expresses the moral foundation that talks a lot about us and we, or in other words, loyalty to the group. The other one talks a lot about this visceral reaction, horror, and so on, which has the feeling of some notion of violation or degradation. So the sense of purity has been violated. And based on the studies that were done in psychology, these tend to happen in a very, very consistent way. So people that have different ideological viewpoints have different moral beliefs. And in general, people on the left tend to prefer or have a stronger preference towards fairness and cheating. And this view of morality is stronger with them. And people on the right have a stronger view of loyalty and authority. Interestingly, everybody cares. So expressing the need for caring for the weak, for others that are deserving of care, is sort of equally used by both sides. All right, so we started by doing some analysis for moral foundation and for framing for the Twitter accounts of members of Congress. Given that I'm running out of time, I'll sort of quickly go over this. This work, the original work, was done using PSL. We used weakly supervised approaches since it's really, really hard to play catch up with the change of topics on Twitter. And the idea is to take a couple of weak classifier over the text and force consistency across ideological camps and social information and temporal activity on Twitter in order to create a more cohesive view. So, one example of that could be to look at the time in which different politicians tweet when they are very active, and to create these histogram of activities and look at the similarity between them. If nothing else, being active around the same time is indicative of caring about the same issue. If you condition that with agreement across ideology, it's likely that people that tweet at the same time and have the same ideology would agree, would have the same stance, potentially even frame the issue in the same way. We also look at people who retweet one another and follow one another as an indication that they would use the same frame. And using our model, so again, like you have to take into account, this is, we used the formulation of framing as a multi-class problem that has 17 different classes. So even our basic model that relies on the text alone, that's doing that got only 37% F-score, is still fairly reasonable. But using our approach, we got it all the way to 58, almost 59. And this is without any explicit supervision. The skyline of using a supervised model was at almost 78. So still some way to go, but still nice. When we tried to apply our model to analyze political discourse, we looked at the Affordable Health Care Act and how people voted on that across different sides of the aisle. And we noticed an interesting effect. So there's a lot of agreement in Democrats and Republicans in how they frame the issue. So both of them talk about the economy, they talk about health and safety and quality of life. However, only Democrats, or almost only Democrats, talk about fairness and equality in the context of the Affordable Health Care Act, or use facts and figures to support their viewpoint. When we looked at aisle-crossing Republicans that voted for the Affordable Health Care Act, we saw that they also used the same frames as Democrats, indicating that if you're using the other party's way of framing the issue, then it's a good sign that you're going to vote against your party. And sort of obvious question here is to try to determine whether, when two sides of the camp use the same frame, if we think about frame as a symbol that explains the argument underlying the stance they take, are they saying the same thing? So we see that both Democrats and Republicans talk about the economy in the context of Obamacare, but are they saying the same thing? And the answer is expected is clearly not. And in our next work, we looked at a more nuanced approach where we break the symbol down into sub-symbols, a more nuanced explanation, a different way to represent framing dimension, such that it would better correlate or better explain the ideological lines. An example of why this is needed is here in the text. We have some text from a left-leaning publication and from Breitbart, which is sort of at this point, a well-known right-winged publication. Both of them on the topic of immigration, both of them framing immigration as something that has to do with the economy. However, it's making almost the opposite claims, right? Focusing either on the contribution of immigrants to the economy and how much they're treated unfairly on the left, or on the right, focusing on America's working and middle class, which suffers from immigration. So both of these in the context of the economy, making almost opposite claims. It's clear that we need to adapt to it. I won't go into the way we did it. It is essentially embedding the different frames that are being used, and then trying to cluster them again such that more coherent subframes can be extracted. One of the ways in which, I think this slide sort of summarized it perfectly, we looked at how often these frames were used on left-leaning and right-leaning publications. Anything that falls on the diagonal means that it is used at exactly the same proportion by both the left and the right. In the left figure, these are the original framing dimensions that we've used that were adapted from Boytzen et al. That use sort of generic policy-based framing. And you could see that a lot of them are very close to the diagonal, right? And reflecting the ambiguity of using them as explanations. On the right, we have the ones that we have extracted. Each one of those subframes can be traced back to a frame, a more general frame on the left side. So when we're talking about something like, reproduction rights, it's going to be connected back to a frame on the left. In this case, having something to do with fairness and not limiting rights. You can see that here there is a much more distinctive usage by either the left or the right, like almost nothing is close to the diagonal. So this provides us with a much better explanation of why people hold the opinion that they do, or what is their view based on when conditioned on ideology. We did a similar analysis when talking about morality. So again, in this case, we're also both relying on what we've observed in the data in our analysis, but also on papers that were released in psychology, where we know that liberals emphasize fairness and conservatives loyalty and authority, but everybody cares. So what does it mean for everybody cares? So the perception that we should think negatively about people harming those deserving care, often children or immigrant groups, low-wage workers, and so on, is something that both liberals and conservatives use. However, liberals and conservatives do not care about the same things. And we would have liked to be able to characterize not just the fact that they've used this moral foundation, there is a moral principles that people on the left and on the right care about, but how it is applied. And this would give us a better way to explain the opinions that are being expressed in a way that's not ambiguous across political camps. Here is an example of how this could be applied. So we have the senator and I are working to protect small businesses from more expensive Obamacare mandates. So in this case, we have entity that's doing the caring, the entity that's is being cared for, in this case, small businesses, and the entity that is causing the harm, or the harming entity. And interestingly, you could see that these roles are almost reversed when looking at tweets from the left and from the right. So in the right case, Obamacare mandates are doing the harming. In the left case, the Affordable Health Care Act, Obamacare, is doing the caring. In the right-wing view, senators from the Republican Party are doing the caring. In the left-wing view, Republicans are doing the harming. One thing that is potentially interesting is that the entity being cared for are businesses in the right-hand side, in the right-wing side, and 130 million Americans on the left-wing side. So this is potentially informative about the priorities of each party. So in order to do that, we define a frame structure. Frame here used differently than I've used before as a semantic frame. That captures the differences in the targets of moral sentiment. We're going to treat each moral foundation as indicative of a frame being activated or invoked in the text. And then we're going to identify specific roles where roles specific to each moral frame are now being defined. So in the context of care, I have the entity that's caring, an entity that's harming, and an entity that is deserving of care or should be cared for. In the case of fairness, I have the target of fairness, the entity that ensuring that fairness is maintained, and an entity that is trying to treat people unfairly. As you can imagine, this is, if you think about how we understand the world, this really aligns with how we understand political perspective. For example, if I were to tell you that the target of care is illegal immigrants, it would be very easy for you to say, well, it's likely that the author is a left-leaning politician. If the causer of harm, rather than the target of care, is illegal immigrant, then the author is more likely to be a right-wing politician. And we would like to leverage that. To do that, we define a Derail model. So again, we have both a symbolic representation and its embedding that happens under the hood. We begin by defining two basic classifiers for the moral foundation identification and the role of specific entities in the tweet in which we identified the moral foundation. We also include other information that help us identify and leverage the messaging preferences of each party by looking at consistency across people from the same side of the aisle and across from it, but also identifying consistency in how entities are viewed. For example, entities are going to be treated positively or negatively, usually by all members of the party, regardless of the moral frame that's being used. So if my party, let's say the Republican Party, views Donald Trump favorably, it doesn't matter what is the moral foundation being used. The role associated with that entity will typically be one that receives moral praise, not the other choice. So we can try to identify those by writing these kind of expectations in a symbolic way. We compared several models for when running this. So I guess the most relevant ones. So we make the distinction between the role prediction and the basic moral foundation prediction. So we can look at different types of BERT modeling in the top part of this red circle under multitask. This does not use any inference, it's just BERT as is or with some additional pre-training. And we can see that the best that we can do is at around 52 for role and 63 for moral foundations. If we take those initial BERT classifiers and use them with PSL, so PSL is our inference engine, using the same symbolic dependencies that we've written here on the left, we're able to increase the performance to 56.5 and almost 69. If we use Derail that also models the interactions over and the relations over the embedding space, then we're able to push this performance all the way to 59 and 72, which is kind of cool. We were very happy about that. Another thing that we did is to try to ask, can we try to decode political discourse at a very large scale? But if I forgot to mention, these are works that are going to appear in this year's EMNLP. So we applied our model to a massive amount of text that's not labeled, and then looked for the most frequent patterns of moral foundation usage and role assignment across the different parties. We have applied it on several topics. In this case, we've used the issue of abortion rights, and we saw some really interesting trends. For example, the most frequent entities used on the left are women, reproduction rights, Planned Parenthood, reproductive care, and the Supreme Court. On the right, it's life, Planned Parenthood, Democrats, born alive, and women. It's interesting if you look, for example, at Planned Parenthood, that is a common target in both cases. This is the target of loyalty, meaning we all stand with Planned Parenthood. And in the case of the right, it's the entity doing the cheating. So it's the same moral foundation, but the negative role rather than the positive one. If we sort of summarize all of this in an entity graph, we can look at the relationship between different entities. And again, this is at an aggregate level by combining all the tweets by all members of Congress on the issue of abortion rights. We can see that on the left, the Supreme Court cares for Planned Parenthood. Planned Parenthood cares for women. The GOP harms women and harms Planned Parenthood. Trump care harms Planned Parenthood. And this is the viewpoint as expressed by tweets from people on the left. On the right, there's, of course, an opposite picture. Democrats harm life, they harm women. Planned Parenthood harms women. The Supreme Court cares for women. So, they are not contradictory, at least here. And the Supreme Court cares for life. I'm guessing that the specific justices in which they were that were extracted from were different in the left and in the right. Okay, so this provides us with a really convenient and powerful way to create explanations for the opinions that people hold based on moral foundation theory extended to capture moral sentiment applied to different targets. The last thing I want to talk about, and I'll try to do it really quickly, is how we can use the neural side of things to take advantage of the context in which the text appears. The idea here is that we can still think about it as a neuro-symbolic approach. However, we don't have explicit symbolic inference. Rather, we have a symbolic relational representation of the data, a graph, let's say. And we want the embedding model that we learned to take that into account and use it. One example of that, and this is to look at news media. So news are often reported with a certain perspective in mind, something that has been talked about a lot. Detecting it can be a very difficult task. So it's in some extreme cases, they're making completely different arguments. These are completely separate stories when reporting about the same issue from a different political perspective. But more commonly, there is a high degree of overlap. The basic facts, the basic mentions of entity that are important to understand the story are going to be the same. And the differences in political perspective are going to be expressed through the importance associated with different facts, causal relationships between different events, picking different witnesses or describing the witnesses differently, which can be very difficult to capture. Here is an example of that where we're talking about the government shutdown during the Trump administration. The text is almost identical in terms of its bag of word representation. However, the meaning is very different. We have Senator warning that attack Trump. The first one emphasizes that. The other, the right-wing representation of this story is that Senator Warner was being attacked for attacking Trump. So the focus is different, despite the fact that from a lexical perspective, it's really hard to tell it apart. Our main insight is that instead of focusing on the nuanced differences, we can focus on the people who prefer one narrative to the other. And in a way, no matter what is the specific news story, those users will consistently keep preferring the same narrative. So if instead of thinking about the nuanced linguistic differences between the two texts, we can try to characterize the social environment of the text, then the problem could be made easier. So we define an information graph where we have text, news articles, users that promote this text on social media, and then we look at other users that these users follow. We specifically looked at politicians that these users follow. We then construct this graph and try to learn over it. Intuitively, what you would like to do here is to find a way to propagate information from the politician, like they're either left or right, back to the users that follow, and from that user down to the document. We would like to push this information over an embedding space such that when we're defining the classification problem, a lot of this information is somehow infused into the text. Unfortunately, if we just take it as in a sort of straightforward ways of saying, for every text, count the number of paths to people on the left or people on the right, this is not particularly useful. You do better than random, but not much better. And the reason is people sometimes follow politicians because they found them entertaining, or they want to be kept up to date. They're not necessarily consistent in who they follow and who they choose to share, whose information they choose to share. From a technical perspective, what we do is we learn a graph embedding where we create two dual representation of nodes, either as social entities or as textual entities. And we go back and forth. We interleave between the two representations, learning a representation of the text, a representation of the graph, social graph embedding, and then trying to make the two as most similar as possible. We've tested this in two ways. In one way, we looked at using this representation in a supervised way, which proved to completely disambiguate, or almost completely disambiguate the problem. In the other scenario, we just looked at it without any direct supervision. And we just said, well, we're going to look at the similarity between the embedding of the political symbol, where the political symbol is embedded close to politicians that are part or believe in that political ideology. And we're going to look at embedding similarity between documents and those symbols. And using that, we were able to get a pretty reasonable performance of about 72. Just to keep, to sort of give context, when using a supervised model using the same text encoder that we've used here in the semi-supervised approach, the performance was under 75. So we have comparable performance to a text-only supervised system. When just relying on doing something like a majority vote or a path-based heuristic, just doing counting, performance is at around 45, which is better than random, but not great. The last thing that I want to talk about is sort of look back to this thoughts and prayers as example that I had in the beginning, where we would like to represent text in a way that takes into account its speaker. I'll refer to it as socially grounded language, where language is not viewed in isolation, but rather it is understood in the context in which it was generated. We're going to model these settings by creating a complex graph of text, the entity that authored the text, the other topics and entities that are mentioned in the text, the relationships between the author and other users, and so on. And I won't go into the details of the architectures, but essentially what we have here is a representation of either people, authors, or entities being discussed, or documents conditioned on their graph environment. Using that, we can create a contextualized representation of the text based on all the information, all the other authors connected to a specific real-world event by picking a subgraph. We can pick a representation of an author, in this case, a politician, on a specific topic by removing all entities from the graph not relevant for a specific topic. What we get here is a relational embedding in which we can capture nuanced opinion based on topics. For example, when looking at the similarity between different members of Congress, typically we would just cluster them as, all people on the left say roughly the same things and all people on the right say roughly the same things. In our case, we can separate between topic-specific issues. So Bernie Sanders is going to be close to Bernie Sanders on guns and environment, but is going to be close to Francis Rooney, who is a Republican on the context of the environment. Francis Rooney is going to be close in the context of guns to Mitch McConnell's on guns and Mitch McConnell's on the environment. So conditioning on different elements of the graph allows us to create topic-sensitive and author-sensitive representations. We've evaluated that by sort of taking the text run through our model and creating a representation of authors on these different topics and looking at the similarity between the NRA grade assigned to different politicians, how supportive are they of pro-gun policies. We replaced the grades like A, B, C, and so on with a statement very supportive of gun control or very unsupportive of gun control, and looked at which politician matches the statement in the best way. Our performance here is still, there's some way to go. We're able to get to around 63% accuracy, but compared to a BERT-based approach that just relies on lexical similarity, we're doing much, much better. And with that, I'll stop. Thanks again for listening to me. If there's one sentence I would like to summarize with, is that contextualizing information is, in my opinion, really necessary for understanding political discourse and social discourse. And I'm very excited to be working on it. Also, many thanks to my students who actually did all of the work. And I'll stop here.
Yeah, thanks, Dan. Yeah, that's really an awesome talk. I really learned a lot from it. Yeah, I think we may just have time to answer one or two questions. Actually, I do have one question. So I'm most curious about that part you use deep relational learning. I think that's the part you have two event compositions and you turn them into latent representations. And then you model the relations, you model transitions between them using a kind of relational representation. I'm actually most curious about what type of relational representation you use in that technology.
In Derail, or in the
yeah, DRL, yeah.
Derail, or in the last one that I've talked about?
Maybe I guess both, because I was looking at the DRL at the beginning.
Okay.
But yeah.
So the idea there is that so let's take a text like, I think we should tax the rich because it will promote social equality. I think we should never tax the rich because it will hurt the economy, right? Contradictory statements.
Yeah.
What I would like to do is to have a representation that allows me to say, with respect to topic, their embedding should be close. With respect to stance, their embedding should be farther apart. You know, they're contradictory. They should be as far as possible. The way Derail does it is that there is an initial entity embedding. In this case, our entities are text, but you know, it could also be people, opinions, you name it. And then using a hierarchical representation, I'm going to say, in the context of the relation called topic, the two texts are going to be very similar. My embedding objective can be push these close. In the context of stance, push them farther apart. So I have a relation-specific representation of text. Now, on top of that representation, I can now define decision rules that say, well, predict topics, predict opinion, predict ideology, and so on. So depending on the specific prism that you're using for understanding the text, you can now condition that representation on, you know, whatever you're trying to predict.
Yeah, for that relation-specific representation, I'm understanding is that's kind of a transition on the entity representation or event representation.
Right.
So
it's, you can think about it as, it's basically something that looks like a tree neural net. Where the embedding of, so there is the embedding of the entities, which we're agnostic about. Right now we're using BERT, but you know, 2 years ago we used BiLSTMs. When we're talking about the relations, again, we're agnostic. Right now we use a form of a tree neural net just because, you know, it's a reasonable choice. But if the number of relation is high, then some attention-based network makes a lot of sense.
Yeah, I think we probably can have more discussions in the follow-up meeting. Yeah, but that part is very interesting to me. Yeah.
We can talk about it.
Cool. Any other questions from the audience? Although I think we are already ahead of time. So I guess, well, the audience, if you have more questions, feel free to reach out to Professor Goldwasser through email. And I think a couple of us is going to meet with you, so we can talk more. Yeah. All
right. Thanks so much for listening, and sorry for running a little bit over time.
No, it's fine. Yeah, thanks a lot for this very rich and inspiring talk. Yeah. Okay. See you soon.